Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Our interview today probes questions about the Roman origins of Gregorian chant. And for this, I had the opportunity to talk with the eminent chant scholar, Dr. Joseph Dyer, a longtime professor at University of Massachusetts, Boston, now retired. Just a quick note before we begin. If you're interested in learning more about chant, the classes at St. Joseph's Seminary this summer that I'd recommend to you are, on the practical side, the Principles of Chant course, July 12th to 16th, Principles of Sacred Music for the historical and spiritual side of things, and that begins June 1st and runs through July 27th, and the Advanced Seminar in Gregorian Chant taught by Dr. William Mart of Stanford for the analytical and in-depth side of things, which runs from July 19th to the 23rd. These classes are offered online, but I have an exciting announcement, and that is that for some of our courses during this summer session, we'll be opening up an in-person option for those who would like to travel to New York to learn. We'll also be able to offer the very affordable room and board options we've had in summers past, though we'll be more limited this summer with the number of students we can have staying on campus. I hope to have more information about that up on the dunwoody.edu website next week, and that's spelled again DUNWOODIE.edu. And this is the first week of May that I'm recording this. Though we can't offer it for all this summer's classes, many of you I know will be gladdened to hear about this option. And now on to the interview. Thanks so much for joining me today, Joe. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me to talk about something I've been very interested in years past.
So, students of sacred music often have a lot of questions about the origins of Gregorian chant, and it is a tricky subject, as you know so well, and it's shrouded in a fair amount of mystery and haze. I'm wondering if we could initiate our discussions today by talking about the Roman Schola Cantorum, a papal choir intimately linked with the origins of the Gregorian repertory, as we'll discuss later. Could you tell us, first of all, what is a Schola Cantorum? And here it seems, from your previous research, that this question has both an architectural answer and a clerical one.
Well, the architectural is a little bit accidental. We'll get to that at the end. But a schola was a kind of guild, and it even had military implications under the empire. For instance, when Benedict talks about the Schola Dominici Servitii, he's not talking so much about an educational institution, but rather about a troop of soldiers, I guess one might say, that were fighting under the banner, if one could say so, of Benedict. Anyway, the Schola Cantorum was a guild of papal singers. And after all, the Pope would need to have singers. He did celebrate Mass in various places in Rome. And they sang a repertoire of chant that was really urban chant. It was not specific to them, I don't think, but sung by other groups or even individual singers in Rome. And they had to develop a chant that went for the entire liturgical year, an annalis cantus, as it's sometimes called. And also the Schola Cantorum, the Roman Schola Cantorum, served as an apprentice school. A lot of people, most people, in fact, in those days, learned their trade, which singing is, by studying it under a guide and sometimes observing what they would do. We first hear of a Schola Cantorum in Ordo Romanus I. This is this famous description of a papal mass on Easter Day. And the Schola is mentioned there several times as the important papal choir. And in Ordo Romanus 27, which is a description of very extravagant papal vespers for Easter Day, the Schola and the boys of the Schola particularly play a very, very important part. The Schola, thinking of it in terms of a school right now, of course, would have graduates. They couldn't all join the papal choir. The choirs were very small. And so they undertook various kinds of clerical careers, maybe working in one of the parish churches of Rome, doing various kinds of things, and singing whatever chants were necessary. Not, of course, they didn't know the chant for all the services of the year, but just for whatever they could do. So we'll probably get back to the organization of the Schola in a bit. But in the long after the Schola was history, they were disbanded in 1370. Architectural historians saw this marble choir in several churches in Rome, San Clemente, Santa Maria, and Cosmedin. And one of them, Ugonio or Panvinio, I forget the author particularly, said, well, this is kind of a Schola Cantorum, a place for the singers to stand and sit. But he, of course, had no knowledge probably of the papal Schola Cantorum. And unfortunately, this has sort of caught on that architectural historians, Sibla de Blau being, of course, the main exception, keep calling it a Schola Cantorum. And in fact, the way I got interested at first was I wondered what connection did it have with the Schola Cantorum? And I found out none at all. So that's about it.
So this mistaken placement called the Schola Cantorum, where was it in the church, for example, in San Clemente?
Oh, well, I'm sure many listeners have already seen San Clemente, and it's in front of the altar. At first, I called it an extended chancel before I really knew what it was, and it sticks out some feet into the nave of the church, right in the middle of the church, and it's surrounded by marble slabs called transenne or cancelli, and with a entryway. Now, the one at San Clemente was installed in the early 12th century. This was a time when the canonial life, that is, life of canons, priests living in community and chanting the divine office, was being pushed by the papacy. And so when San Clemente was rebuilt in the early 12th century, a large marble choir was installed. And one can also see that in Santa Maria and Cosmedin, even though that's a restoration from the 19th century.
So moving back now to these origins of the Schola Cantorum, I appreciated in an article you have in a book called Young Choristers, your discussion of the link that scholae might have had to orphanages in their origin. Was this a link that was novel in Rome, or did the precedent come from somewhere else?
Well, I guess from somewhere else. Susan Boynton, who was the editor of that volume, asked me to write about boy singers of the Schola Cantorum, and I said, oh, gee, what can I tell you? I'm not sure I know anything. And she said, well, try. So I did. First of all, one might ask the question, were all the children of the Schola, these recruits that were being taught, were they all orphans? And I think probably not, because orphans, they do not have a mother and a father, but they may not always be the most talented children in terms of voice. We do read in Ordo Romanus 36 a point that clerics, let's say priests or someone, and will find puri bene psalentes, finding boys who sing well in various places around a city, and they should be moved into the Schola Cantorum. In fact, that is mentioned in Ordo 36. And if they're really talented intellectually, into the cubiculum, which would be the papal household. For instance, Sergius II, the Pope, when he was a young boy, was orphaned, and he received his basic education in the Schola Cantorum, one of the few popes to do so. Briefly about the Eastern connection, well, I should say, first of all, that there was a connection in Rome between orphans and the Schola, because there's a document that tries to recover some property owned by the Schola Cantorum. And the point of recovering the property and the income that it generated was nec ergo cantorum deficeret ordo, lest the ordo of cantors fail. So it was for support. And its other documents linked it with an orphanotrophium. In the early 7th century, there were a lot of Greeks coming to Rome because they were escaping either Persians or Muslims. And there was an orphanotrophium founded in Constantinople. It was a very prominent place for children to go, orphans to go. And some of these orphans were perhaps illegitimate children of the nobility. So it was well supported by the nobility, interestingly. Andrew of Crete, the great famous hymnographer of the Eastern Church, 660 to 740, was once the director of the orphanotrophium. So presumably it was linked with music there. And it's probable that when the Greeks came, monks and others, to Rome in the early 7th century, that an orphanotropium was founded. And it could be that just the two institutions, Schola Cantorum and orphanotropium, merged at some point.
So is it possible that it, maybe had this link to an orphanotropium, as you mentioned, but that like so many institutions in the church, it became prestigious in its students, and then more wealthy families started sending their children there?
It's hard to know. I think probably wealthy families would train their children at home. And if you were an aristocrat, you would go immediately into the papal household and be cultivated there. Because the Schola Cantorum was a general sort of basic education in the liberal arts, you might say, not all of them, of course, but in reading the scriptures and understanding the traditions of the church, the liturgy and whatnot, not just vocal training.
Right. So when did the Roman Schola Cantorum come into existence, and what evidence is there surrounding this question?
Well, first of all of the medieval archives of the Roman Church have been lost. So one can't answer any question about anything, pretty much, of that sort. So there is no foundation document. But I think the important thing is that, as I said in the beginning, there were papal singers. There always had to be papal singers because the liturgy was always sung. But the key thing is, when did it become a schola? And becoming a schola in Rome gave you might say, a place at the table. It's like getting a portfolio when you're a minister, a state minister. And there was a schola of subdeacons, a schola of notaries, a schola of defensors. And these were high officials in the papal administration. So becoming a schola cantorum meant a step up from just being an ad hoc group of singers. So it was an uptick in status. When did it happen? Well, it was probably in the late 7th century, because it's first mentioned then, last half of the 7th century, something of that sort. That's when it happened. It could be under Sergius I. One doesn't really know.
So this would have postdated Pope St. Gregory the Great, whose reign ended in 604.
Oh, absolutely so, yes.
So if Pope Gregory I did not found the Schola Cantorum, properly speaking, did he have any relationship to its origins?
Well, of course, that associating Pope Gregory I with anything is an emblem of its importance. You know how often things are attributed to famous people in which they had no connection whatsoever with them.
St. Augustine seems to have said everything, and that's worth quoting.
I suppose Charlemagne invented the electric incandescent light bulb or something. Well, the first connection, and this is a very interesting one, first connection with Gregory and music and the Schola Cantorum is in this prologue to the Gregorian Antiphonor, the Mass Antiphonor, as it's sometimes called. And you probably know it. It's a prologue in Italian origin, which begins with the word Gregorius Praesul. And it says that Gregorius Praesul is responsible for putting together this Libellus Musicae Artis, a little book, well, it's a big book actually, of musical art of the Schola Cantorum. And therefore, this linked Gregory, the chant books, and also the Schola Cantorum. Remember that now that this is around the year 800. And then there is a biography written by John Himonides, about 870, 872, something of that sort, which definitely says that Gregory founded a schola, and he did put together the Antiphonor, and he mentioned some relics of Gregory's bed, where he sang, liked to sing on his bed, apparently. He was a very ill man, so he spent a lot of time in his bed. And another relic was the ferula, which he threatened the children with, because when he's teaching them about, I guess they weren't behaving, it probably was more of a baton or something of office. Now remember, John was writing in 870, 872. So think of in our own time, he was talking about something that happened 275 years before. And it's if somebody in 2021 were writing about something that happened in 1746. There's a bit of a gap there.
Right.
But that's what linked some historical links. And some scholars, now we're getting to the modern age here, There's a decree of 595, a Roman synod, in which Gregory prevented or forbade deacons to sing. He had understood that cantors were being appointed deacons. Now, that seems almost impossible for a saltus like that, as it's called, to jump from cantor to deacon. And it's thought that because Gregory said deacons can't sing anymore, and if we need to have something done, let subdeacons or clerics in minor orders take care of it. And someone said, aha, look at that. That's the foundation of the Schola Cantorum right there, because they were subdeacons and lower orders, acolytes and whatnot. My view, however, is that for 132 years, around before and after Gregory, the people elected to the papacy were deacons. That was the step right before the papacy. There weren't any cardinals or anything, but deacons. So if Gregory is trying to prevent unworthy people from being ordained deacons, he's really trying to protect the papacy from unworthy candidates. So it didn't have particularly a musical intent in mind, I think, much as many scholars think it did.
But what's interesting also is that, at that time, deacons really, in addition to being, as you mentioned, the step before the papacy, really held a lot of power and were the kind of controllers of the material goods of the church, right?
Yes, they were. And Jerome, particularly, and another author, Ambrosiaster, complained about the brazen arrogance of the deacons. That, for instance, when the Pope was away, they would dare to sit just like priests, when deacons were, of course, supposed to stand. A lot of my research on Rome has to do with trying to place it in its Roman context, the administrative wheelings and dealings, shall we say, which are very illuminating.
Right. So if this is the limit of what Gregory the Great had to do with, kind of ordering the proper roles for clerics, what are some theories about how Pope St. Gregory the Great's name came to be associated with Gregorian chant?
Well, there is a letter sent by Pope Leo IV, who built the Leonine walls around Vatican City. And he's writing to a bishop, maybe in Farfa, which is in Italy, about Gregoriana Carmina, and instructing him that he should be, and his clerics singing Gregoriana Carmina. So at least, remember the antiphoners are 800, and this Gregoriana Carmina is half century later. So it was in the 9th century, late 8th probably, that Gregory's name got associated with this chant. Now, which chant? Of course, as we will be getting to the problem of Old Roman and Gregorian chant. And Gregorian chant, that name got attached to the repertoire that was being spread in Northern Europe by the singers of the Roman Schola Cantorum and Frankish cantors as well. And it's sort of like the Gregorian sacramentary, which probably a lot of people have heard of. That name was picked in order to distinguish it from the Gelasian sacramentary, which was much more common in Francia at the time.
So in James McKinnon's famous book, The Advent Project, he proposed that the Roman Schola Cantorum embarked upon a project of adding to an existing chant repertory. So there was an existing chant repertory that was being sung in Rome, but that it was added to so that you would have all the chants in all the necessary places for the liturgy, beginning with the chants of Advent, thus the name of his book.
Yes.
Could you help us understand his theory a bit better and perhaps evaluate some of its strengths and weaknesses so that we can understand perhaps this distinction between the layers of chant?
It's a very, very large book, and some very intricate arguments, particularly those based on the gospel communions and so forth. And Jim had a wonderful sense for the chant and the melody. So whatever one says about the Advent Project, and I think the problems have to do with chronology more than anything else, his very sensitive comments about the music he loved was really, they're just so beautiful. And it's, as you know, the book was published posthumously. He was diagnosed with bone cancer and died within less than a year. Very, very tragic. Jim's thesis was, and I'm quoting here, the creation of the Roman Mass proper was more a single concerted act than one that took place in stages. In other words, the Schola Cantorum intervened decisively. This was not just a matter of collecting, arranging, sorting things out, and with the inherited repertoire. They were in charge, and they were going to do something very drastic to reshape everything, the chants, the organization, and whatnot. Now, one of the problems, and of course, Jim noticed, naturally, that the chants of Advent and the Christmas cycle are indeed very beautifully arranged. They're thematically unified, wonderful chants, wonderful choice of texts for the chants and everything, and probably most people listening know that already. But the curious thing is why they would have, the Schola Cantorum, why they would have chosen Advent as a paradigm, Advent as a model for properizing the chants, because Jim's view was, of course, that the ideal Advent project would have a specific chant for a specific day or saint's feast and for no other. And that was the idea of properization, which very much has caught on, rightly so. The thing is, though, at Rome, Advent came at the end of sacramentaries and lectionaries, not at the beginning. So it's hard to know why Roman cantors would have chosen the end of the liturgical year, so to speak, as a paradigm for the beginning. Now, of course, there were 6 Sundays in Advent at one time, and Dom Jean-Clair has suggested that, well, what happened was these 6 Sundays, the singers, whoever may have, when it became 4, just redistributed the chants so that the extra chants were given to the Ember Days of December. And that would give you a cohesive package, so to speak. Jim, of course, had to acknowledge that this was not flawless, that the singers seemed to do well sometime and not so well at other times. He thought the introits were very good. That was a successful kind of thing. The post-Pentecost graduals were not. And some things are a bit hard to explain. For instance, when Gregory II, 715 to 731, made the Thursdays of Lent liturgical, before that, Mass was not celebrated on the Thursdays of Lent. This was 715, 720, let's say, something like that, which is about 30 years after the Advent project, supposedly. Yet, the singers of the Schola Cantorum, who were responsible for filling in these Thursdays, they didn't know how to compose new music at all. They chose chants from the chants of the post-Pentecost series. And the Roman communion chants, 1/4 of them are responsories that they borrowed from the office. So it doesn't seem like a very comprehensive, creative endeavor.
So if McKinnon's basic thesis about this concerted effort at properization is not correct by the Roman Schola Cantorum, what role do you think the Roman Schola Cantorum actually played in the development of the Roman chant repertory?
Well, I think maybe the thing that Jim sort of in that quotation that I read, something that took place in stages, cumulative. As you know, that probably the first chant of the Mass was the responsorial psalm, become gradual, then communion, introit, and so forth. These gets inserted in stages. And then as more and more days of the year become liturgical, as they call them, more and more chants were needed. And so perhaps the not inconsiderable achievement of the Roman Schola Cantorum in the late 7th century and early 8th was organizing these things into a coherent whole without any kind of overriding principle. They did not reject or try to manipulate the past, but merely to inherit it and make it accessible to the future.
So here is the big question that has engulfed generations of chant scholars. When we're speaking about a chant repertory of the Roman Schola Cantorum, how is that repertory, those chants, related to what we now know of as the Gregorian chant repertory?
Well, yeah, that's the big question. And it would probably take another whole broadcast to go through all of that. It's a great mystery, and I don't think we know any more about it than when it was first investigated beginning in the 50s. As you know, what happened, Dom Makarov was attempting to restore Gregorian chant on the basis of the best manuscripts that he had identified. And these were published in the Paléographie Musicale. And he was hunting around Europe and trying to get rid of the Pustet edition and other corrupt traditions he thought of. So he goes to Rome and he discovers two manuscripts there in the archive of St. Peter's, which have the exact same texts. Remember, these are the exact same texts in Old Roman and Gregorian chant. And here was a repertoire that was undoubtedly Roman. He couldn't deny it, yet it was very different. And so he assumed that it was just corrupt, that what the Romans had done was just forgot the music and made this horrible mess out of the whole business. And there's some people who do believe that. Of course, the reigning theory, shall I say, is that the Roman singers were commanded, and Charlemagne and his father as well, particularly Pepin, wanted to get the Roman liturgy installed in Francia. And there wasn't necessarily resistance to this. I think the Franks were very, very eager for things Roman. And so he wanted the authentic sacramentary and all those kinds of things. And so the Roman singers came up and they tried to teach their music to the Franks. Now, A, did the Franks learn it exactly the way they were taught? Or B, did they think, well, we hear what these people are singing, but we just don't like it. We don't like it at all. And they then re-edited it and changed it, metamorphosed it, you might almost say, into a completely different musical style, Franco or Franco-Roman, if you want to call it that. Many people do, and that is Gregorian chant. And we do know that, of course, the texts are from 800, around the end of the 9th century. You begin to get notations, and so that's a tradition. Old Roman chant, or Roman chant, of course, as you know, is not attested until the end of the 11th century, 1071. This Old Roman gradual of Santa Cecilia, which is in fact the oldest known notated gradual. So what happened between, let's say, 771, or around Charlemagne visited Rome, and 1071? What did they really remember all the music, or did they kind of make a mess of singing it and not remembering it well?
Because they would have been singing something up to that point. Obviously, they weren't singing nothing in Francia.
Oh yes, up till that point they were singing, quote, Gallican chant, but it's hard to know how big a repertoire that was. Did that have enough music for the entire year? We just really don't know. That question has not been explored. And so here you get a repertoire that covers all the bases, so to speak. And in that way, it's very good. But if the Franks just didn't like the way the Romans were singing, and this we'll hear, I think, in a moment, the different style between the two, and it's very marked. Old Roman chant being this rambling, scrolling, small motion movement all the time, not particularly tonally directed. Gregorian chant, of course, very concise, clear, leaps and in the melody, and indeed perhaps more tonally organized. So it's a very different aesthetic, very different. Those who see both originating in Rome, it's hard to explain because Old Roman is really an Italianate chant, like Beneventan chant. And Gregorian chant, as far as we know, just doesn't have the Italianate feel to it at all.
Yeah. When you compare the two, to my mind, it always seems like the Old Roman chant is like a pile of spaghetti on your plate, whereas the Gregorian chant is, a well-organized meal with a proportionality in its colors and relationship one dish to another.
Yes, I think, I can't remember it right now, but I think Bruno Stäblein, who of course wouldn't have compared it to spaghetti, but it's something like that. Yes, it's a sort of, well, to our ears anyway, rambling, I don't know, any kind of an adjective you put to it, metaphysical, spiritual, whatnot. You say, well, the same things can apply to Gregorian chant as well. So, qualitative descriptions can be, yeah, but I wouldn't disagree with you. And it someplace looks like it in the edition as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. So we have two versions of a chant here that that I'll sing for our listeners. It's the Communion Mirabantur. I don't know if you wanted to introduce our listeners to this text and these melodies in any way.
Yeah, one thing we didn't talk about the Schola Cantorum is the fact that we talk about music all the time and not about the texts. And one of the great achievements, I think, of this, I guess, the Schola Cantorum is arranging these texts to set to music, because it's not exactly the text of the Bible, as you know, but it's sort of edited in a way.
Like a libretto.
Well, yes, Ken Levy liked to call it a libretto, and I don't know exactly what to call it. Jim McKinnon made up this, I think, perhaps whimsical, the master of the Advent lyrics, as he called him, who made up all these, arranged the texts. And there sometimes Domine gets left out or put in, but Mirabantur comes from Luke 4:22, and the Latin text reads, Mirabantur in verbis gratiae, quae procedebant de ore ipsius. And this was Jesus at the synagogue in Nazareth saying, this scripture has been fulfilled in your presence. Mirabantur in verbis gratiae quae procedebant de ore ipsius. And ipsius of him, of course, would be Jesus. Now, the chant text is Mirabantur omnes deis quae procedebant de ore Dei. They all wondered from those things, not the words of grace, but those things which proceeded from the mouth of God. And it's a very skillful treatment of the text to make it self-standing. They all wondered at those things which proceeded from the mouth of God. And it could be applied not to Jesus specifically, but to, the mouth of God. So it could fit anywhere.
Right. So what's your opinion, Joe? Should I sing the Gregorian version first or the Old Roman version?
Well, to be mischievous, I could suggest you sing both of them and then make the listeners guess.
That sounds like a great idea. Okay, so here's version number 1. And version number 2.
I'm sure people are applauding. Thank you very much.
So should we reveal the secret of which one was which?
Well, yeah, you could, or you could do it, and
So the first version was the Old Roman version, and perhaps you could tell us more about which manuscript that comes from. And the second one was the Gregorian version.
Yeah, and of course, one can't really analyze it now so much, but Gregorian version, it cadences first on a G, and then on a C at procedebant, and then finally to G. And of course, there's this famous arch form, I guess, that I've studied chant with a pupil of Don Maccaro, and I think he talked a lot about that. But with the Old Roman one, it's much more, scrolling. I guess that's one of the words sometimes used. It just sort of wanders about all these small little steps or anything of some sort. And it's not really so defined phrase-wise, I guess you might say, as the clarity of the Gregorian one, without drawing any kind of qualitative considerations. Now, the reason I picked this is because this is one of those gospel communions, and Jim McKinnon intended to consider these to be very late. And one of the chief objects of successes, should we say, of the Schola Cantorum was organizing these gospel communions. And he thought that Mirabantur only, that is the Luke chapter 4, verses 22 and whatnot, as a gospel reading at Mass, entered the repertoire only in the middle of the 8th century. In other words, it's a very late entry, and the communion would not have been composed before that time. So it'd be actually a Frankish kind of intervention. Of course, as it turns out, that pericope, that reading, is found in the earliest Roman list of readings, the Capitulare Evangelium in a Würzburg manuscript. So it's actually before 645. It's not late at all. And so that kind of throws the chronology he proposes somewhat off.
Right. So if we summarize kind of our basic trajectory of the chant repertory, so you've got this Roman body of chant that continues in existence in Rome and is then later notated. And that's what we refer to as the Old Roman chant. But in the meantime, the Roman chant had interacted with the Gallican chant and produced some sort of hybrid. We don't know exactly how, as you mentioned. And that is the Gregorian repertory, which was actually notated earlier than the Old Roman being written down, even though the Old Roman chant, thus its name, is predating the Gregorian chant.
Yes, and of course, one of the questions raised is Old Rome. How old, in other words, is Old Roman chant? Since this was term coined by Dom Andoyer early in the 20th century. Is it unlike Roman chant of the 7th century? In what way does it resemble it? What is the power of memory? And this is one of the things, that's come up a lot in the questions about the transmission of Roman chant to Francia. The memory required to memorize all of these chants, the offertories with their verses, how long those are. It requires a tremendous amount of skill. And that's how some of these boys would be, I think, in the Schola Cantorum, spotted by talent scouts. If they had a good voice and a very capacious, quick memory, that would be good. But there are many questions I think will never be answered because we just don't have the documents.
Right. Yeah. So how and when did Gregorian chant eventually push out Old Roman chant from being sung in Rome? Because obviously in the later Middle Ages, when you go to Rome, what they were singing was Gregorian chant and not Old Roman chant.
It was probably a very gradual process. And, Rome was not a very happy place in the Middle Ages. There were, in the earlier part, late antiquity, there were invasions. And what was the population of Rome? How could they sustain a Schola Cantorum and all these kinds of things? The other question, and I will get to that, but the other question is, why was Old Roman chant preserved anyway? It was just not of use to anyone, but yet we have 5 manuscripts. Almost everything else from medieval Rome, liturgical manuscripts, have been lost. So to find those 5 preserved is really remarkable. And I think it has to do with maybe the conservatism of Roman clergy and this Romana Fraternitas. It's a group of priests, a burial society that banded together. And they were very interested in keeping the church in Rome, Roman. Why is that? Well, the curia, that is the circle around the Pope, was becoming internationalized. And all of these clerics were coming, reform clerics, if you want to call them that, from all over Europe. And they all sang Gregorian chant. So the papacy, the papal court, had probably shifted over a lot to Gregorian chant. That's what people were singing. The reformed canons of the Lateran, who came from Lucca, all they knew was Gregorian chant. And so it just very gradually withered away. The Gregorian chant was the status chant. After all, it was the Pope. It was sung all over Europe. And here's this little provincial backwater kind of music called Roman chant. Fewer and fewer people were singing it, but it's just a marvel, an absolute marvel, that it was preserved in these very beautiful manuscripts, except for maybe one is run of the mill, in the late 11th and the 12th century. that, I think, is one of the more remarkable things.
Well, thank you so much for helping us understand this complicated history and one that's so difficult with so many different strains running and simultaneously. But I've always appreciated your writing about these issues. And I'm wondering if you could point our listeners to a place where they might read more of your writing about these topics.
Well, that would be good. One thing I don't like is reading my own things because I'm afraid I'm going to find something I wish I had said. That's difficult. But there's this site called academia.edu, and that has I've posted a number of articles on that. Seems to me my hit is liturgy and liturgical books. There are people all over the world in cities I've never heard of and countries I barely have heard of. And on academia.edu, there's a list of my publications that I've put up there, and I think it's pretty thorough if anyone's interested. And
great. So they would just search your name, and your name is Joseph Dyer, spelled Dyer.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you so much, Joe, and I really appreciate you being with us today.
Oh, not at all, and I appreciate so much the invitation. It's been a learning process for me too.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.